So these slides look very, very boring. I used to have fancy graphics in the background, and for some reason, when a Mac version of PowerPoint goes over to a Windows machine, the graphics become the slide and everything becomes illegible, and so I'm just going to have to ask you to do your best not to fall asleep, or fall asleep. Frankly, it's going to be a long session, and you may need your rest. So I am going to talk to you about OA from a librarian's perspective, and I use the indefinite article very, very advisedly here. I want to make it very clear at the outset, and it will probably become clearer as I go on, that mine is by no means the standard view of open access taken by librarians. And in fact, if there are librarians in the room, you may see items being thrown as I talk. And I hope that those of my colleagues in libraries who are here will take the opportunity to disagree with what I say during the discussion section. So I'll probably find more support for my view on open access in this room, but I will tell you the same thing that I would say if this were a room full of librarians, and that is that as enjoyable as it may be to have somebody get up in front of you and stoke the fires of your own opinions, that can also be dangerous. And I'll say no more about that for now. I will, however, try to figure out. All right, there we go. So to start with, in order to set the context for what I'm going to say about open access specifically, I want to make a few points about the purpose of the library, specifically the purpose of research libraries, in my view. Contrary to what some of us in libraries, maybe many of us, believe, none of the items on this list is, in fact, either the or even a fundamental purpose of research libraries. This is. And the way that research libraries facilitate the scholarly work of students and faculty and researchers is by putting them in contact with the scholarly tools and resources that they need in order to do their scholarly work. A colleague of mine, who's the director of the library at Notre Dame, Diane Walker, put this much, much more elegantly when she said that libraries exist to connect people with knowledge across space and time. Now, that may sound like a very floofy way of expressing what libraries do, but in fact, if you think about it, it's a very simple and a very elegantly accurate way of describing what libraries do. If the library's pursuit of any one of the goals in this list gets in the way or undermines the support that the library gives to students and faculty and researchers in doing their scholarly work, then in my view that library needs to either change the ways in which it's pursuing that goal, or it simply needs to stop pursuing it. So, having gotten that premise established, I want to look at the primary question that I've been asked to address, which is what is the impact of OA on libraries? And the reason that I went through all of this leading up to this slide is that I wanted to be able to say that this, in fact, I think is the wrong question for us to be asking. This, I think, is the right question. And it might seem like the answer to this question is really quite simple, because obviously anything that makes more information available for free is going to help libraries facilitate the scholarly work of their patrons. But unfortunately, it actually is not that simple, because the purpose of the library is not to build a big and beautifully crafted and comprehensive collection that provides access to as much information as possible. The purpose of the library is to provide access to the right information, which I define as the information that actually helps our patrons do the actual work that they are doing. Now, open access models, like any other publishing model, are going to have both intended and unintended consequences, and, as with any other publishing model, those consequences themselves are going to have a combination of positive and negative impacts on the library's ability to help students and scholars. So, looking at OA overall, these are what I see as the intended consequences. This is what we are trying to do when we implement open access. So first of all, we're trying to give people unrestricted access to the production of scholars, and the sort of knock-on effects of that open access, or the effects are going to include new ways for people to discover content that they need and can use, making things easier for people to work with each other across disciplines. I actually lifted these pretty much directly from the Spark website, and an increased pace of research and innovation. It is also frequently argued that by making, and this is a proposition that has a lot of face validity, that if you give people more access to more content, that content will get cited more, and will have a higher impact. Now, there has been some research done, notably by Phil Davis, who's here today, that questions the actual truth of that apparently valid proposition, but nevertheless, this is one of the intended consequences of OA. Making it possible to reuse and text mine or data mine and repurpose scholarly information and scholarly data, and of course accelerating the pace of research, and then there's the just sort of the moral good of saying, look, the public paid for this research to be done. The public ought to have access to the reports that are based on the research that they paid for. So these are the intended consequences. There are unintended consequences that vary somewhat depending on the model of OA that you're talking about. We tend to talk about gold OA as an author pays model, but that's almost always a misnomer, because in fact it's pretty rarely the author who actually pays the APC out of his or her pocket. Instead, APCs are often written into research grants. In some cases, they're underwritten by the institution where the scholar works. But what this means is that that money no longer stands in the way of readers getting access to the content under a gold OA model. That's the intended consequence. But it also means that money is shifted from one priority, such as the underwriting of research, to another priority, which is making previously funded research freely available to the public. The block grants in the UK that happen under Finch are another very good example of this. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad trade-off, and I'm not saying it's a good trade-off, but it is, in fact, a trade-off. And getting people, quite frankly, to have rational conversations about the reality of that trade-off or about the nature of the trade-off is sometimes a struggle. Perverse incentives are a more troublesome aspect of gold OA. Obviously, note that I'm not saying that any particular publisher is actually succumbing to these incentives. I'm only saying that the incentives are there whenever you make your money by accepting papers rather than by selling access to them. So if in fact you are going to make more money by accepting more papers, that necessarily carries with it an incentive to accept content that is less good, to minimize the amount of time and effort that you expend on peer review and on editing. Again, there are a lot of very good gold OA and hybrid OA publishers who resist the temptation to succumb to these incentives, but the incentives are still there, and I think it's safe to say that they are not an intended consequence of gold OA. The green model, as Steve pointed out, leaves most of the traditional publishing system unaltered, so it really doesn't involve the same kinds of weirdness and disruption that a gold model does. However, it does affect the publisher's ability to sell access to the content that it's invested in. Obviously, the shorter the embargo period, the more likely it is that institutions and individuals are going to cancel their subscriptions. But I think there's a less obvious dynamic or a less obvious parameter to the cancellation dynamic as well, and that is that the more narrowly niche-y the journal is, the more libraries there are going to be that will be willing to wait out a longer embargo. And with journal prices trending the way that they have and the way that they continue to, libraries now are forced to cancel more journals that they would prefer not to cancel. And in that environment, a 12-month embargo starts looking a lot more reasonable. Waiting out a 12-month embargo starts looking like a lot more reasonable strategy than it might have in the past. And of course, I would also point out that this is a bed that publishers have made for themselves. So Consequences for libraries specifically under each of these OA models. Under an OA model, libraries are going to spend more time discriminating. Well, I'm sorry, more OA in general for libraries, it is fine. I mean, it means less money spent on subscriptions and it means more content for our patrons. But more gold OA in particular means that libraries and their patrons end up having to spend more time discriminating because, again, any system that provides publishers with less incentive to discriminate up front is one that's going to tend to result in lower quality publications. This means that reasonable readers are going to be more cautious and are going to spend more time trying to discern quality where in the past they would have felt more confident in trusting the vetting processes of the publisher. It also, of course, means the redirection of funds in support of APCs, which I mentioned earlier. But there's another thing that's starting to happen downstream from the funding agencies in terms of redirecting money for APCs. And that is that at a number of research libraries, my own included, libraries are starting to experiment with setting aside their own funds in order to support APCs on behalf of faculty on campus. And I'll tell you, because I think I have time to, this is something we've been experimenting with for a couple of years at the University of Utah. The first year that we did this, we sent word out to faculty on campus and said, look, if you are interested in publishing in a Gold OA journal, tell us what it is you want to publish and where, and we didn't know what kind of response rate we were going to get, so we said, send us your proposal and we'll consider whether we're going to underwrite your APC. Unsurprisingly, we discovered that when you offer faculty free money, they will take it. I'll be writing a paper on this soon about this little-known economic dynamic. But what that did was it put us in a very, to me, interesting situation where we kind of sat there and we said, okay, well, this works. Now what? Do we continue providing this very small amount of money? Do we expand the program and throw more money at it? If so, how much and where is it going to come from? And what do we hope to accomplish by this? It's certainly not a very cost-efficient way of getting information out to the public. It is a way of helping to support a model that we might want to support and promote. But this is the kind of experiment that leads to very deep soul searching about what the library's priorities ought to be, and that's a topic for another presentation. So more green OA. Green represents mostly upside for libraries because it's all the good stuff that comes from traditional publishing and access models, and it's none of the more questionable aspects that come from the gold model. But this assumes that the stuff available under the green model is, in fact, the specific stuff that our students and our scholars need. But all other things being equal, the green OA model is really pretty good for libraries. But this last bullet here, I think, is very interesting. Rethinking the fundamental nature of our collections in libraries is not something that we tend to take up easily or happily. Libraries, like universities generally, are not built to be nimble and responsive. They are built to be huge and immovable. And so questioning what really should constitute our collection is a very, very difficult thing for us to do. And it is clearly, to my mind, one unintended consequence of implementing Green OA on the library side. Consequences for student and faculty, obviously, in general terms, more OA means more access, which is great. More gold OA for researchers means actually less grant funding to the degree that APCs are written into grants by other people. And it means, therefore, more competition for grant funds. Or it means something else, or it means that the money comes from elsewhere, which almost invariably is going to be from either out of your own personal pocket or from your library or your academic department. Green OA means, again, more access to content. It also means more red tape. I'm not sure that's a huge barrier or a huge problem, but it does mean that there's more process involved in writing an article, whereas in the past you used to just sort of turn your article over to the publisher, and the publisher would do all the work after that, or virtually all the work after that. Of course, there's also more red tape to the degree that you're publishing in more than one market. If you're publishing in markets that have different requirements, then you're going to have to keep track of those. And it also means a disrupted market for the articles that you are selling. As an author, you are selling articles to publishers. You are handing over your copyright in return for the services that the publisher provides. The shorter the embargo under a green model, the less likely it is, this may be a little bit of a stretch, but the less likely it is that publishers are going to stay in business. Fewer publishers means fewer journals, which in turn means fewer publishing opportunities for authors. This kind of a shift could end up being either a net loss for authors, if it means it's harder to get published, or it could mean a net gain if it means that the traditional structure of scholarly communication ends up being messed with in interesting and helpful ways. But either way, it certainly means disruption. So this is what I would say is the bottom line in terms of the impacts of OA on the library's ability to help students and instructors and scholars. By free lunch, I'm not just talking about money. It also means consequences. Anything that we do that messes with an existing system is going to have consequences, good and bad, intended and unintended. That's the sense in which I'm saying that there's no free lunch. And the last point that I would make is I once got in an argument on a listserv with a particularly prominent OA advocate who when I said, look, here, this was a long time ago when we were like 10 or 12 years ago, when the concept of green and gold were still quite new, and I said, look, under a green model, there's no way that this is not going to hurt publishers. And his response, which he repeated over and over at length, was, it is not the purpose of OA to hurt publishers. It is not the purpose of OA to hurt publishers. And what I couldn't seem to convince him of was that it's not intentions that ultimately matter. It's consequences that ultimately matter, and our consequences do not necessarily follow from our intentions. And that's something that all of us need to bear in mind in libraries and on the publisher side whenever we're making decisions about bringing new models to bear. That's not to say that we shouldn't bring in new models. We absolutely should. But we need to bear in mind that it's the actual consequences of our actions rather than what we hoped would be the consequences of our actions that are going to affect the marketplace and the scholarly environment. Thank you.